Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. You're here today with me, Ramjee Chandran. Thank you for joining me on episode 72 of season 2. When we left the story in the previous episode, Bengaluru had crossed the line from being a plan into being a place. By the 1530s, the Pete was active, alive and hopping. A new town had entered the political map of the plateau, and it was doing exactly what Kempe Gowda had hoped it would do. It was working. Meanwhile, things were not great in Vijayanagara. Their failings would have a profound effect on the politics of the Mysore Deccan and the Bangalore plateau, and today I make a beginning with that. But first, and as always, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, who make it possible for me to bring you this podcast. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. By 1540, the Pete no longer depended on its founders' enthusiasm. It had begun to regulate itself through its physical layout, its civic infrastructure, and thriving communities. From the very beginning, this market town was a success. Goods from every direction came to and through the Pete. Cotton from the Congo region, rice from the east. Horse dealers arrived from the west coast. Many of them headed to the east coast ports, trying to navigate their way around the Portuguese cartas or shipping license fees. The Pete came into its own almost as once. Almost the region was simply waiting for it to happen, which it probably was. It was in this early period of growth that Kempe Gowda received the highest recognition for his efforts. Vijayanagara Emperor and Kempe Gowda's overlord, Aliya Raya, made a huge grant to Kempe Gowda. He granted Kempe Gowda control and therefore revenue rights over 12 hublis or villages. Here's the list: Hale Bengaluru, Bartur, Yelahanka, Bevuru, Halasuru, Kengeri, Talagattapura, Jigani, Kumbalkodu, Kannalli, Chikkabanavara and Hesaraghatta. Because this territory immediately pretty much defines the whole city of Bangalore as we know it today, let's see how by examining them, or where they are or were, and getting a view of the whole territory. All the directions I say are in relation to the Pete. Hale Bengaluru and Yelahanka are directly located north, and it is related to the village of Kodigehalli, which can be accessed by a left turn on the road to the airport. It is said that this was the village of his wife, and he named Bengaluru after that village. To the east, Alsur and Bartur, and then Begur, Jigani, Talagattapura, Kengeri and Kumbalgodu sweep in a wide arc right across the south. Kannahalli, Chikkabanavara and Hesaraghatta complete the west. If you followed what I just said on the map, you know what, rewind and play it back if you want to see how this looks on Google Maps. You will see that these villages define a wide circle around Bengaluru and how similar the region was even 500 years ago. In fact, only in recent years has the city even expanded to fill up all these areas and bring them all under one administration. Even back then, the grant of the hublis gave definition to Kempe Gowda's fief. Some of the villages included in this list here are puzzling. Yelahanka and Hale Bengaluru were already in Kempe Gowda's fief, and those were his capitals. And we know from previous episodes that he had annexed Domlur, Alsur and Hesaraghatta to give his Pete some territorial cohesion. This question as to why cannot be answered because there are really no sources to corroborate anything. Even the grant of the hublis are all from secondary sources, some even tertiary sources, and none of them, not even B.L. Rice, cites the source. But as with all of history that doesn't have clear evidence, one looks for associated evidence, and we know from later records that Chikkadevaraja Vadayar acquired these 12 hublis cheaply, it said, for providing assistance to the Mughal general Qasim Khan in 1687. The very reference to this parcel of land as 12 hublis goes to corroborate the earlier references to Kempe Gowda receiving that grant. Anyway, together these hublis were said to yield a revenue estimated at 30,000 pagodas or gold units of currency. It's worth pausing to understand the scale of Aliya Raya's grant. A Vijayanagara gold pagoda of that period weighed about 3.4 grams, So 30,000 pagodas was really 102 kilograms of gold in revenues. For a provincial chief, that was immense. A revenue base that large set him up as perhaps the richest and most powerful Padagar of the South Kingdom. As you can see, for Kempe Gowda, in one stroke it transformed his single little Pete from a promising settlement into the administrative center of a large recognized territorial unit. It's worth asking also, why such generosity on Achyuta's part? To evaluate the very plausibility of this grant's magnitude and specifics, we need to situate Achyuta Raya's action within the political and economic realities of the dynasty of the time. A dynasty that was buffeted in the wake of Krishnadeva Raya's death. When Achyuta Raya took the throne in 1529, after his famous brother, he had inherited a kingdom that was solid, but it was under strain. The court was split into factions. Aliya Rama Raya was getting more influential by the day. He was Krishnadeva Raya's son-in-law and a contender for the throne. The northern front with Bijapur needed constant attention. Even the Portuguese on the west coast, formerly great friends, were becoming harder and harder to predict. In this situation, keeping the empire stable, especially the interior provinces, became a priority. Now, the south did not attract outside invaders like the north did, but it was potentially the source for ambitions of the king's own Padagars. Indeed, that had happened recently with Gangaraja of Shimasamudram. And this is where Kempe Gowda enters the picture. The grant he received from Achyuta Raya was not simply a reward, it was a part of a practical imperial strategy. The Mysore plateau was peaceful, profitable, and far away from the main theatres of conflict. Now the emperor needed reliable men there, and Kempe Gowda had already proven that he could be trusted, so strengthening his hand made perfect sense. Achyuta Raya's permission for Kempe Gowda's fort, therefore, was not only an endorsement of Kempe Gowda's vision, but it really was an act of imperial housekeeping, a way to create stability in the southern plateau. A fortified town under a dependable Nada Prabhu gave Vijayanagara that safe administrative center that they needed in the south. The grant of the 12 Hublis was therefore a major step up. A Hubli was a recognized revenue unit, usually made up of several villages. Gaining 12 of Hublis gave Kempe Gowda the manpower and resources he needed for a proper capital. It also affirmed that shifting his base from Yelahanka to the new fortified Bengaluru Pete was not just a local decision, it was now supported by the empire. With this grant, Bengaluru moved from being a promising idea, as I said, to the accepted headquarters, local headquarters of a larger territory. And Kempe Gowda, once the chief of Yelahanka, became more than that. He became a central figure in managing the stability of the southern plateau for the empire. And things got real. And when that happens, there are the typical pulls and pushes, jealousies, petty rivalries, and so on that happen. A grant the size of 12 Hublis didn't exist in the vacuum. It had consequences, economic, political, and importantly, personal. And it raised questions then as it raises questions for us today. In the 16th century, the sudden access to a revenue stream of 30,000 pagodas, by the math I gave you before the break, was the kind of income that made a chief visible. And visibility, as we know, can be both a privilege and a risk. Let's look at the risk. The deeper question is this: where did these Hublis come from? Land doesn't appear out of nowhere. If 12 revenue units were granted to Kempe Gowda from Achyuta, logically they must have been detached from somebody else's assignment. And this is where local politics becomes murky. We cannot say with certainty whose fief was reduced to make way for Kempe Gowda's expansion. The sources simply don't tell us once again. Some of the Hublis, Yelahanka and Hale Bengaluru, were already within his sphere. Others like Halasuru, Hesargatta, we know he accessed earlier. But for the rest, especially that southern group running from Begur through Jigani and Talagattapura to Kengeri, it's hard to believe that these were unclaimed or unassigned lands waiting for Achyuta to gift them to Kempe Gowda. A cluster of villages with a combined yield of 30,000 pagodas would almost certainly have belonged to an existing Padagar. Who? Was it the Channapatna chief whose jealousy later caused Kempe Gowda a great deal of trouble? Well, That question hangs unresolved because none of the sources names a dispossessed party. And now for a much-needed commercial break, and when I come back, Achyuta Raya passes on, Rama Raya takes charge, and nothing is well with the empire. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
Hi, I'm back. Just because we don't know the names of the Palegars from whom the 12 Hublis must have been taken away, the absence of that information does not mean the absence of resentment. If a chief lost land, or even believed that he had lost land to make way for a new Bengaluru Nadu, the seeds of rivalry would have been sown right there. And this is where we must think not as modern historians would, but as people living in the plateau in the 1540s, when, whether or not you lost territory to this grant, the balance of power had shifted, and new kids on the block are rarely welcomed with silence, leave alone garlands. While so, Achyuta Raya's grant to Kempe Gowda must be seen for what it was, an imperial calculation, not a whimsical gift made from a sudden frisson of generosity as a personal reward. This grant bestowed not so much a gift on Kempe Gowda, but a high responsibility, and it was a scale which Kempe Gowda would embrace. Even before Achyuta Raya died in 1542, he had been unseated and imprisoned back in Vijayanagara, and this happened in 1540, 2 years before his death. During this time and after his death, there was intrigue, murder, and all-round skullduggery, and when he died, Sadashiva Raya took the throne. But Aliya Rama Raya, a strong and reputedly intelligent man, turned Sadashiva Raya into a puppet, and some say imprisoned puppet, and Aliya Rama Raya became the de facto head of Vijayanagara. The story of that transition merits its own podcast episode. Under Rama Raya, the tone of the state changed. Diplomatically, Vijayanagara took on a more assertive position with the Deccan Sultanates. Administratively, the empire began to demand more predictable behavior from all its Palegars, the provincial chiefs. And this is the environment into which Kempe Gowda's success and the rising commercial traffic through Bengaluru all made him more visible. In a court becoming increasingly wary of strong regional chiefs, visibility itself became the liability. The economic success of the Pete amplified the problem. Bengaluru's growth drew trade away from the older centers like Hoskote and Channapatna. When the Palegars of those regions found their revenue diminishing, resentment obviously followed. So what had once been a routine competition among neighboring Palegars now acquired a sharper edge, mainly because the imperial court was more receptive to complaints about ambitious subordinates. There was a new leader who was receptive to backbiting. While Bengaluru became prosperous, the empire became paranoid. In such a climate, a rumor merely had to be persuasive to be taken seriously. It had only to be plausible. And the rumor that would alter the course of Kempe Gowda's life took the form of a straightforward accusation that Kempe Gowda had established a mint, a Tankashale as it's called, and he had begun to issue coins in his own name. The coins were said to bear the figure of Bhairadeva, the family deity, and they were called the Veerabhadra coins. Now, issuing coins itself was treason. It was one of the definitive steps towards declaring independence. But was any of this true? The question of whether these coins were ever struck is a matter that scholars have discussed without reaching a firm conclusion. The total absence of evidence, even by association, suggests that the whole thing may have been a lie. There were no coins found, ever. But that doesn't settle the question either, because local mintings of this kind, if they occurred at all, were produced in small numbers, and they were the first things to be confiscated and melted if a chief fell out of favor. But the allocation itself, true, exaggerated, or entirely invented, reached the court at a moment when Aliya Rama Raya was at his paranoid worst. The source of this accusation was clear. It was the Palegar of Channapatna, Jagadeva Raya. He had long regarded Kempe Gowda as the regional rival. Their territories bordered each other, the caravan routes intersected, their revenue claims overlapped. But as Bangalore expanded, Channapatna's importance declined, and the chief who controlled Channapatna had little incentive to pretend otherwise. Jagadeva Raya understood the mood of the capital. Presenting Kempe Gowda as a man who was aching to overstep his authority and that he had begun to behave as though he was no longer simply a Nada Prabhu but a claimant to independent authority, was his plan. In the hierarchy of the Vijayanagara state, there were several lines a provincial chief could cross, and most of them would be forgiven. Striking coins was not one of them. A mint was a royal prerogative. Even the appearance of independent minting is a politically queasy moment. That was enough for an inquiry to become an order. The response was swift. Kempe Gowda was summoned to Vijayanagara. Summons of this kind were not unusual, and a loyal chief was expected to attend promptly, presenting himself at the court with deference. The journey from Bengaluru to Vijayanagara would have taken several days. He would have travelled with a small escort, not an armed retinue. Nothing in the administrative record suggests that he anticipated any danger. His tribute was up to date. His work in the Nadu had been approved, appreciated even. His relations with the empire, until this point, had been formal but undisturbed. When Kempe Gowda presented himself at the imperial court, he was arrested. He was taken into custody and transported to Anegundi, the older capital, on the northern bank of the Tungabhadra. Anegundi was still fortified and served on occasion as a place of confinement for political detainees. Its distance from the southern provinces and its history as a royal seat made it suitable for holding high-ranking prisoners without giving them the indignity of common incarceration. The detention of Kempe Gowda had immediate administrative consequences. His territories, including Bangalore and the 12 Hublis granted earlier, were placed under sequestration. Control of the region was transferred, at least nominally, to Jagadeva Raya of Channapatna, whose complaint had triggered this very process. And for the first time since its foundation, the new Pete stood without its founder. It is important to understand the nature of such imprisonment in the 16th century. It was not a criminal penalty in the modern sense, nor was it a formal condemnation. It was a precautionary measure enforced by a state that believed that it could not afford misrepresentation of any loyalty. A detained chief could be freed and everything restored after a period of review, but he could also be kept for years, depending on the pressures of the moment. The purpose was containment, the containment of his influence, not merely of the person. It is a testament to the planning of Bengaluru that right through this, the market town did not collapse. Its markets continued to function, but its political direction was suspended. A civic center like that without its patrons becomes cautious, and in these years, Bengaluru grew more slowly than it might have otherwise. A town that had depended on the disciplined guidance of a single administrator now had to manage itself by practice rather than by leadership. For Kempe Gowda himself, those years at Anegundi marked the first real interruption in a career that had otherwise moved with a clear sense of purpose. We don't know the exact conditions of his confinement, but tradition holds that he remained there for almost 5 years. Long enough for a political season to change, long enough for the empire to face new pressures. In the 5 years, it is said that Rama Raya's arrogance had made more than an enemy of Adil Shah of Bijapur, and their troubles had started to get out of hand. Those pressures, the emerging coalition of the Deccan Sultanates, the shifting priorities of the Vijayanagara ministers, and the changing needs of the South Kingdom would eventually contribute to a reassessment of Kempe Gowda's case. From the perspective of the court, a boundary had been crossed by the allegation of minting coins. From the perspective of the region, a respected chief had disappeared into imperial custody. And from the perspective of the new town that he had built, a question now hovered that no one could answer, whether Bengaluru would continue as the center of his Nadu, or whether it would just simply fade back into the network of ordinary settlements that had dotted the plateau. The answer to that question belonged to the years after Kempe Gowda's release. For now, Kempe Gowda remained an Anegundi, confined not by rebellion, but simply by the weight of a rumour that had arrived exactly at the wrong time. In the next episode, the whole world changes. Kempe Gowda's short reign after his release, his social reforms, and his death. Vijayanagara falls, and the Mysore Deccan comes into its own. So much is happening, so much to talk about. All that coming up very soon. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.